Welcome to Horrified Stories, where fear comes to life. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more spine-chilling tales. Let's start our today's story. The Silent Carnival, games no one wins. The first time anyone in Stillwater heard about the carnival, it was through a set of cryptic flyers tacked to telephone poles and left on store counters. The flyers were peculiar, printed on thick black paper with bold, silver lettering that seemed to shimmer when the light hit it just right. Come one, come all, the Silent Carnival awaits. Games of wonder, prizes beyond imagination, and thrills you'll never forget. Tonight's only enter at sunset. No address, no directions, just a small, hand-drawn map at the bottom of the flyer, showing a winding path through the woods at the edge of town. By the end of the week, the town was abuzz. Stillwater was a small town where not much happened. News of the carnival spread quickly, and the lack of any prior announcements or advertising only made it more intriguing. "I don't like it," said Ruth, the owner of the diner. "What kind of carnival shows up unannounced? It's probably some kind of scam." But the teenagers hanging out in the corner booth weren't listening. "Dude, it sounds awesome," said Kevin, his eyes lighting up. "I heard the prices are insane. Someone said they're giving out brand new motorcycles." His friend Jake leaned in, skeptical but intrigued. How would anyone around here even afford that? Still, it'd be worth checking out. The night the carnival was set to open, a group of friends Evan, Jake, Melanie, and Sarah decided to find it. None of them had seen any setup or heard any trucks rolling into town, but the map on the flyer was simple enough to follow. They met at the edge of the woods just before sunset, flashlights in hand. "This is dumb," Sarah muttered, pulling her jacket tighter around her shoulders. "We don't even know if this thing is real." Kevin grinned, holding up his phone. "And if it's not, we'll still have a creepy woods adventure. I'm recording the whole thing for the channel." Jake rolled his eyes. "Your channel has, like, 20 subscribers." "Furry 4, Kevin corrected, dramatically pointing his flashlight into the trees. "Now, onward to fame and fortune." As they walked deeper into the woods, the air grew colder, and the trees seemed to close in around them. The laughter and chatter faded, replaced by an uneasy silence. The path was well-worn but eerily empty, as if no one else in town had dared to come. "I don't like this," Melanie whispered, her flashlight flickering. "Maybe we should turn back." But just as she spoke, the forest opened up into a wide clearing. And there it was, the Silent Carnival. The carnival was unlike anything they had ever seen. The tents were tall and shimmering, their colors shifting in the dim light. Strings of glowing lanterns hung between them, casting an ethereal glow over the entire clearing. The air smelled faintly of burned sugar and something metallic, like old coins. At the center of it all was a massive carousel, its painted horses flouncing mid-gallop. The music it played was soft and slow, almost hypnotic, like a lullaby. Yet, for all its grandeur, the carnival was silent. There were no crowds, no barkers shouting at passersby, no children running between the tents, just rows of empty booths and attractions, waiting. "This is weird," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Kevin spun in a slow circle, his phone recording everything. "This is amazing. It's like something out of a movie." They approached the first booth, its wooden sign reading, "Test your strength." A massive mallet leaned against the side. An tall, thin man in a black suit stood behind the counter. He didn't say a word, just smiled, his teeth unnaturally white. Aye," Kevin said, stepping forward. "How do we?" The man gestured to the mallet. Jake smirked. "Classic. I've got this." He grabbed the mallet and swung it over his head, bringing it down with all his strength. The puck shot up the tower, hitting the bell with a loud ding. The man clapped slowly, his smile widening. Then he reached under the counter and pulled out a small, ornate box. "For me?" Jake asked, grinning as he took it. The man nodded, his eyes gleaming. Inside the box was a gold coin, heavy and warm to the touch. Jake held it up, admiring it in the lantern light. "Dude, this is legit," he said. But Melanie frowned. "Let's try another booth." As they moved through the carnival, the games grew stranger. At one booth, Sarah had to solve a series of riddles, posed by a mannequin with a porcelain face. The answers came to her as if whispered in her ear, and when she finished, she was handed a black ribbon that tied itself around her wrist. At another, Melanie played a card game against an invisible opponent. She won a silver key that burned her hand when she touched it. "This place is creeping me out," Melanie said as they walked past the carousel. Kevin was undeterred. "Come on, it's harmless. It's just a carnival." But Sarah stopped, her eyes wide. Do you hear that? The others fell silent. From somewhere in the distance came the faint sound of laughter, high-pitched and echoing, like a child's giggle. I think we should leave, Melanie said. No way, Kevin said, pointing to a large tent with swirling black and white stripes. That's gotta be the main attraction. The inside of the tent was enormous, far larger than it should have been based on its exterior. It was dimly lit, with rows of empty seats surrounding a central stage. At the far end of the tent, a man in a dark top hat stood waiting. Welcome, he said, his voice smooth and deep, to the final game. Kevin's phone wavered in his hand. What do we win? The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. That depends. Are you willing to play? Jake stepped forward, clutching his gold coin. What's the game? The man's eyes gleamed. Survival. The lanterns around the tent flickered, and the entrance flaps slammed shut behind them. The tent was silent except for the faint hum of the lanterns. Kevin, Jake, Melanie, and Sarah stood frowning in the dim light, their eyes fixed on the man in the top hat. His presence was unsettling, too tall, too still, as if he were more shadow than person. Survival? Jake asked, his voice breaking the silence. The man's smile widened. Yes, it's a simple game. Really, you play, you win, and you leave. Or, you lose. And what happens if we lose? Melanie's voice was barely above a whisper. The man tilted his head, his eyes gleaming like polished onyx. Then you stay? A cold chill ran through the group. I'm out, Sarah said, stepping back toward the tent flap. We're not doing this. But when she tried to pull it open, the flap didn't budge. The fabric felt like iron in her hands. The man's voice echoed through the tent. Once you enter the big tent, the game begins. There is no leaving until it ends. With a snap of his fingers, the stage came to life. Lanterns hanging from the ceiling flared brighter, illuminating a circular arena with four raised platforms, each painted in a different color: red, blue, green, and yellow. Each of you will take your place, the man said, gesturing toward the platforms. The rules are simple. Complete your challenges, earn your freedom, fail, and, well, you see. The group hesitated, glancing at one another. Kevin broke the silence, trying to mask his fear with bravado. Okay, fine, let's do this. It's just a game, right? Jake reluctantly followed. Might as well. No point standing here all night. Melanie and Sarah exchanged worried looks but eventually stepped onto their platforms. The moment they did, translucent walls shot up around each platform, trapping them in individual enclosures. The man clapped his hands, and a deep, disembodied voice boomed through the tent. Round 1, the past. Kevin's enclosure filled with a thick mist, obscuring his vision. When it cleared, he was standing in a dimly lit living room that looked eerily familiar. His parents' old house. What the hell? He muttered, spinning in place. A voice, soft and sweet, called out from behind him. Kevin, dinner's ready. He frowned. It was his mother's voice, but she had died 3 years ago. In the center of the room, a dining table appeared, set for 3 plates of steaming food, Saturday untouched. And at the head of the table was his mother, her face turned away. Mom, Kevin's voice cracked as he stepped closer. Her head turned slowly, unnaturally, until her eyes locked on his. They were black voids, empty and endless. You left me, she said, her voice growing deeper, angrier. You let me die alone. Kevin stumbled back, heart pounding. No, that's not true. The room began to warp, the walls melting like wax. His mother's figure rose, growing taller, her shadow stretching toward him. Stay, she whispered. Stay with me forever. A timer appeared on the wall, counting down from 2 minutes. In Jake's enclosure, he found himself back at his high school gym, the air thick with the smell of sweat and disappointment. He was alone, or so he thought, until he heard a familiar voice behind him. Hey, loser. Jake turned to see Marcus, the school bully who had tormented him for years. Oh wait, Marcus wasn't normal. His skin was pale and cracked, his eyes glowing faintly. What's the matter, Jake? Marcus sneered, stepping closer. Still can't stand up for yourself. Jake's hands clenched into fists. You're not real. This isn't real. But Marcus laughed, his voice echoing unnaturally. Oh, I'm real enough. And this time, you can run. The lights in the gym flickered, and Marcus lunged. Melanie's enclosure was filled with water, rising rapidly around her ankles. She was standing in her childhood swimming pool, the one where she'd nearly drowned as a kid. Not this, she whispered, panic setting in. The water climbed higher, reaching her knees, then her waist. She tried to move, but the water was thick, like syrup, holding her in place. On the far side of the pool, a figure floated face down. It was a young girl, her long hair fanned out like seaweed. "Help me," the girl's voice echoed, though her lips didn't move. Melanie's chest tightened. She recognized the girl. It was her younger self. In Sarah's enclosure, she was surrounded by mirrors, each reflecting a different version of herself. Some were smiling, others crying, but one stood still, staring at her with cold, hollow eyes. The mirrored Sarah stepped forward, her movements no longer bound to the glass. "You've always been afraid of being alone," the reflection said, its voice sharp and accusing. "So much so that you push everyone away. Isn't that right?" Sarah backed away, her breathing shallow. "You don't know me," the reflection's smile twisted. "Oh, but I do. I'm you, after all." In each enclosure, the timer ticked down relentlessly. Kevin had to face his mother's shadow, confronting the guilt he'd carried since her death. He shouted apologies, tears streaming down his face, until the shadow dissolved and the mist cleared. Jake stood his ground against Marcus, using his wits to outmaneuver the monstrous bully. When the timer hit 0, Marcus vanished, leaving Jake trembling but alive. Melanie forced herself to dive into the thick water, dragging her younger self to the surface. The pool drained instantly, and she gasped for air as the enclosure returned to normal. Sarah shattered the mirror with her bare hands, silencing her reflection. The shards dissolved, and she collapsed to her knees, shaking. When the walls around the platforms lowered, the group looked at one another, their faces pale and drawn. "What the hell was that?" Jake asked, his voice shaking. The man in the top hat smiled. "Congratulations, you've survived the first round, but there are 3 more to go." Sarah glared at him. "We're not playing anymore. Let us out." The man's expression darkened. "I'm afraid that's not how this works." With another snap of his fingers, the translucent walls shot up again, trapping them in their enclosures. The disembodied voice returned. "Round 2, the present." The lights in the tent flickered, and the games began again. The disembodied voice echoed in the tent as translucent walls once again trapped Kevin, Jake, Melanie, and Sarah in their enclosures. The man in the top hat disappeared into the shadows, leaving them alone with the faint hum of the lanterns. Round 2, the present. The air grew colder. The group could feel an unseen force shifting around them, setting the stage for the next round of the twisted game. When the mist in Kevin's enclosure cleared, he found himself standing in his bedroom. But something was off. The walls seemed taller, the corners darker, and the air heavy with tension. On his desk Saturday, his laptop, its screen glowing faintly. The browser was open to his video channel. "Why here?" he muttered. The screen suddenly flickered to life, showing a video of him, but it wasn't one he recognized. In the video, Kevin Saturday in front of the camera, his expression grim. "This is my last video," his recorded self said. "I lied to everyone. I pretended to be someone I'm not for clicks and views, but it's all fake. I'm fake." Kevin stepped back, his chest tightening. "No, no, no," he said, shaking his head. "That's not me. I never said that." The recorded Kevin continued, his voice growing more desperate. "I betrayed my friends to chase a dream that wasn't even mine, and now I've lost everything." The screen turned black, replaced by a single sentence. "Tell the truth, or lose everything." The laptop began to spark, the room growing darker. Kevin tried to scream, but his voice was gone. Jake's enclosure became a construction site, one he knew all too well. It was his current job, one he'd taken to make ends meet after dropping out of college. The ground was littered with tools and debris, and that air was filled with the distant sound of machinery. "Why here?" he asked, his voice echoing. From behind a stack of metal beams, a figure emerged. It was his foreman, Mr. Allen, but his face was distorted, his features stretched and inhuman. "You cut corners, Jake," the foreman said, his voice hollow and cold. "You think no one notices, but the mistakes pile up, and one day, someone will pay the price." Jake backed away. "I didn't mean to. It was just once." The ground beneath him began to shake, and the beams around him started to collapse. "Admit it," the foreman said, stepping closer, "or be buried beneath the weight of your lies." Melanie found herself standing in the middle of her kitchen, the one she shared with her fiancé. Then, the air was thick with the smell of burnt food, and the sound of a baby crying echoed from down the hall. "What is this?" she whispered. The crying grew louder, shrill and relentless. Melanie's hands began to tremble. "You're not ready," a voice said from behind her. She spun around to see Ben, but his face was blank, featureless. "You can't handle what's coming," he said. his voice monotone. You fell. You always do. No, she said, shaking her head. That's not true. The baby's cries turned into wails, and the walls around her began to close in. Prove it, the voice said, echoing from every direction. Sarah's enclosure transformed into her tiny apartment, the one she'd worked so hard to afford, but it was different now, cold and lifeless, the windows boarded up, and the furniture covered in dust. On the couch sat a figure, its back to her. Who are you? She asked, her voice trembling. The figure turned, and Sarah's breath caught. It was her, but older. Her hair was gray, her eyes hollow, and her face lined with despair. Alone, the older Sarah whispered. That's how it ends for you. Alone and forgotten. No, Sarah said, stepping back. I have friends. I have a life. The older Sarah laughed, a dry, humorless sound. They'll leave. They always do. And you push them away before they get the chance. The room began to collapse inward, shadows creeping closer. In each enclosure, a clock appeared, counting down from 5 minutes. The challenges were clear: confront the truths of their present lives, or be consumed by the carnival's illusions. Kevin stared at the laptop, his heart pounding. He thought about the lies he'd told on his channel, the exaggerated stories, and the moments he'd twisted the truth to gain attention. I'm sorry, he whispered, tears streaming down his face. I lied. I just wanted to be someone people cared about. The screen flickered, and the words changed. Truth sets you free. The room dissolved, and Kevin collapsed to his knees in his enclosure, gasping for air. As the beams around him began to fall, Jake shouted, I admit it. I mess up. I cut corners to save time, but I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt. The foreman's distorted face melted away, and the construction site faded into darkness. Jake found himself back in his enclosure, shaking but alive. Melanie pushed through the suffocating fear and followed the sound of the baby's cries. She opened the nursery door to find an empty crib. I'm scared, she admitted, her voice breaking, but I'll try. I won't let fear stop me. The crying stopped, and the kitchen returned to normal. Melanie wiped her tears as she reappeared in her enclosure. Sarah stepped toward her older self, her hands trembling. You're wrong, she said. I'm not going to end up like you. I won't let myself. The older Sarah smiled faintly, her features softening before dissolving into mist. The apartment faded, and Sarah fell to her knees in her enclosure, her breathing ragged. When the walls lowered, the group looked at one another, their faces pale and exhausted. We survived, Kevin said, his voice shaky. For now, Jake muttered. The man in the top had reappeared, clapping slowly. Well done, he said, his smile cold, but the game is far from over. The voice boomed again. Round 3, the future. The lanterns dimmed, and the walls shot up once more. The translucent walls surrounded Kevin, Jake, Melanie, and Sarah once again, as the disembodied voice echoed through the big tent. Round 3, the future. The air inside the enclosures grew heavy, thick with a strange metallic tang. The group felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if the carnival itself was alive and feeding on their fear. This has to be the last round, Kevin muttered, gripping his knees. Don't count on it, Jake replied, his voice strained. The man in the top hat stood motionless in the shadows, his smile widening as the mist began to fill the enclosures. Prepare to see what lies ahead, the voice said, its tone colder than before. When the mist cleared, Kevin found himself standing in a massive, empty warehouse. The air was stale, and the faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. In the center of the room was a computer desk with a single monitor. As he approached, the screen flickered to life, showing a feed of his video channel. The subscriber count read 12,456,203. What? Kevin muttered, leaning closer. I made it. The screen changed, showing a montage of videos. Each one featured Kevin doing increasingly outrageous stunts, endangering himself and others. The audience numbers skyrocketed, but the comments scrolling across the screen were vicious. What a sellout. This guy's a joke. How far will it go just for views? No, Kevin whispered. That's not me. I wouldn't. The screen went dark, and a voice echoed through the warehouse. Fame has a price. Are you willing to pay it? Suddenly, the lights overhead began to shatter one by one, plunging the room into darkness. Jake's enclosure morphed into a high-rise construction site, its skeleton exposed to the wind. He was standing on a steel beam, the city sprawling out below him. Not again, he muttered, gripping the beam for balance. A gust of wind nearly knocked him off, and he turned to see a massive crane, swinging a load of steel beams dangerously close. "You're in charge now, Jake," a voice called out. He looked down to see down scenes of workers below, all waiting for his instructions. But as he shouted down to them, the beams above began to collapse, one after another. "Stop!" he screamed. "Get out of the way!" But they didn't move. "You built this future," the voice said, cold and mocking, "and now it's falling apart." Melanie found herself in a nursery, but this one was pristine and sterile, like something out of a catalog. The walls were painted soft pastels, and a mobile spun silently above an empty crib. She stepped closer, her heart pounding. Inside the crib was a photograph, its edges burned. It showed her holding a baby, but her face was blurred, and the baby's features were unrecognizable. "You can't do this," a voice whispered from the shadows. Melanie turned to see her reflection in the mirror on the wall, but it wasn't her, it was an older, worn-down version of herself, her eyes filled with regret. "You ruin everything," the reflection said. "You lose what matters most." The mirror cracked, and the pieces fell into the crib, covering the photo. Sarah's enclosure became a dimly lit hospital room. The air smelled of antiseptic, and the steady beep of a heart monitor echoed in the silence. On the bed lay an old woman, frail and motionless. Sarah stepped closer, and her breath caught in her throat. It was her. The woman's eyes opened slowly, clouded and empty. "Who are you?" the older Sarah whispered. I'm you," Sarah said, tears welling up. The older Sarah reached out, her hand trembling. "Then why did you let me end up like this?" The heart monitor flatlined, and the room plunged into darkness. The group faced their futures, each challenge more harrowing than the last. A clock appeared in every enclosure, counting down from 5 minutes. They had one chance to change their fates. As the lights shattered around him, Kevin shouted, "I won't become that. I'll do things my way. I don't need to fake who I am for anyone." The screen blinked out, and the warehouse dissolved into mist. Kevin collapsed back into his enclosure, trembling but alive. Jake gripped the beam, his voice steady. "I'll take responsibility. I'll do better. No more shortcuts." The collapsing structure frowned, then crumbled into dust. Jake reappeared in his enclosure, gasping for air. Melanie reached into the crib, pulling the shards of glass away from the photograph. "I won't let fear define me," she said. "I'll protect what matters." The nursery faded, and Melanie found herself back in the tent, tears streaming down her face. Sarah knelt by the hospital bed, gripping the older woman's hand. "I won't let this happen," she said. "I'll let people in. I won't push them away." The heart monitor beeped steadily, and the room dissolved into light. Sarah reappeared in her enclosure, sobbing. The translucent walls lowered, and the group stood together once more, shaken but alive. The man in the top hat appeared in the center of the tent, his smile unnervingly wide. "Well done," he said. "You've proven yourselves worthy." "Worthy of what?" Kevin demanded. The man's eyes glinted. "Of freedom." The tent began to collapse around them, the lanterns flickering out one by one. "Go," the man said, his voice echoing, "before the carnival changes its mind." The group ran, their feet pounding against the dirt path as the carnival dissolved behind them. When they reached the edge of the woods, the clearing was empty. The silent carnival was gone, leaving only the faint scent of burnt sugar in the air. Back in Stillwater, the group tried to make sense of what had happened. They agreed never to speak of the carnival again, but the experience left a mark on each of them. Kevin deleted his channel and focused on making genuine connections. Jake took his work seriously, ensuring no one was ever hurt on his watch. Melanie embraced the future with hope, no longer paralyzed by fear. And Sarah learned to let people in, rebuilding the relationships she had once pushed away. But late at night, when the wind was just right, they could still hear the faint sound of carnival music drifting through the woods, a haunting reminder of the games no one wins. If you like this story, don't forget to hit the like button, share and subscribe the channel. Help us grow. Thanks for watching.